Dane Clark. I'm by no means the expert in steering and suspension. I don't build engines for a living like Redline does, and he talks about, Brent Johnson's great, he talks about all the stuff he does. I'm one derby guy talking to other derby guys about experiences that I've seen, things that I do, things that I've done different, and a lot of what people call me and ask me questions about. I get a lot of questions about steering, suspension, materials, and a lot of stuff. For those that don't know, my background is in material sciences and engineering. Some people ask me quite a bit of questions. So this isn't a sales pitch. I don't sell parts. I don't make parts. I'm not going to try to sell you parts. I'm going to try to give you food for thought when you're building whatever you're building, be it a stock, stock car to go run a stock derby versus, running the biggest show in the country, and how to best use your dollar and what makes sense for you in your application. Guys, feel free to interrupt me as we go. This isn't we're going to wait till the end for questions. If you have any questions about my opinions or my thoughts, I'll certainly give them to you. But that's what I got. So, yeah. I guess the first part of steering components we need to talk about is ball joints. There are lots of ball joints out there. There's a lot of fancy ones. You guys can go to, AutoZone and you can buy a $10 ball joint. You can go out back here and buy a $200 ball joint. What's the right ball joint for you? In a stock car, all the ball joint really does is all the upper ball joint really does is keeps the spindle located. There's not a ton of pressure on it, because you know that whenever you cut the ball joint, it falls a little bit and the shock holds everything up. So the upper ball joint's just kind of floating there. Unfortunately, us as derby car drivers decide that, we're going to weld the A-arms down and weld the suspension down, and then your ball joint is in a totally different life. The ball joint has to hold everything down. And whenever, if you look at a factory ball joint, especially a factory one, this top piece is just a little piece of stamped steel. How many of you have blown balls through the top of the ball joint? Why? Because it's holding everything down. In a stock application, stock ball joints, totally fine. If you want to spend the money to get a little better material in the pin, that's what you're getting. You're not going to get any more downforce. You're not going to get any more effort from the ball joint and stuff like that. So you can spend, $100 on a ball joint for your application, or you're just out there and your suspension is moving. That's, you can pretty much run stock ones. I've seen tons of guys show up with stock ball joints and win demolition derbies. The key to making ball joints last is don't get hit in the tires. But if you want to spend the money, you can certainly buy bigger, fancy, better ball joints. My preference, if you're going to spend the money on standard ball joints and tie rods, are the Moog ones. Material-wise, they're the best material. The pins will bend; they will not break. A lot of the other, like racing-style ball joints, the pins are super hard, so they're going to snap. When you get hit really hard, those pins are going to snap off. Where the Moogs are, tailored towards like the NASCAR stuff, and if you're in NASCAR, you don't want your wheel to come flying off, right? So they make sure it will bend to fall before it falls off, which is really important. So, that's regular ball joints. So, for those of you that, don't want to spend the money or want to go a different route, there's unconventional ball joints. I've ran about every one of these on here in different applications. You can go to Tractor Supply and buy this dude for $8. Weld it in the top, throw a 3/4 inch bolt in it, and go to town. It's a total of $7, $8 to have a ball joint that's way better than factory. If you use a GM regular A-arm, those will weld exactly in the hole. You don't even have to cut the A-arm, they'll fall in the hole. You can weld them in there, drill your spindle out to 3/4 inch, pop her in there, tighten her up, and let her rip. We're building derby cars, guys. Got to make it through the night. Sure, is a tractor joint the best, the most perfectly made joint in the world? No. At the end of the night, is it going to be sloppy? Yes. Is it going to break on you? It might, but it's way stronger than a regular ball joint. and it's a whopping, $9. I've seen guys run those like that setup on full-blown, full weld cars, win derbies with them, just with a grade 8 bolt and a little weld-in piece. Another piece I'd highly recommend on these is you buy 1-inch ones for those of you in rear suspension that, my preference on all rear suspension cars, I don't care what class you're running, how hard the car is. If it is a coil sprung car, run suspension. Run suspension. Because if somebody drives up on the back of your car, especially if you guys like to put your shit in the dirt, what happens is somebody blasts you, and if you have the car held up, it's going to go straight to the dirt. Dane Clark did it to me at Bash for Cash in 2011. That's when I learned, man, I need to run suspension. I welded top and bottom, and the humps were so hard, everything was so hard, he drove up on me with a nose, put it right in the dirt. I never did that again. Running rear suspension on coil sprung cars is extremely important. And if you put these in your package tray, then when your rear end starts to move or your frame starts to move, everything can move around. If you're just running a bolt through there, when the car actually tries to move, it's going to be ripping all the threads off that bolt the whole time. And it's a whopping $10. Cut the hole, drop it in, weld it, call it a day. So, that's my opinion on that stuff. You can buy ones as fancy and as expensive as those. Those are like $100 and some. They actually have a rubber joint in there, so they have a little bit of movement and stuff like that. Unfortunately, there's a lot of shows that won't let you run this stuff because, well, if you want my honest opinion, you're not buying it from a derby vendor. That's my honest opinion. I mean, this stuff's cheap. Anybody can weld it in. If you got a welder, you can weld it in. But unfortunately, everybody wants to buy the same parts all the time, and sometimes you got to hide it. Slap the top of a ball joint over top of it, weld it on there, and it looks like a ball joint walking around it. But when you look from the bottom, it's a bolt.
What?
Seen it done tons of times. And I'm sure that some guys are wondering, and with these style tie rods, I mean, I ran those for a really long time, and I had better luck with them than I did with the Moog ones, just drilling out spindles and bolting them. But unfortunately, a lot of your big shows say you have to run a tie rod in. So you can spend $200 on a nice set of tie rods, or you can order a set of those for QA1 for $20. Just depends on what the show allows you to do. So it just depends on how it works. I'm sure there's some guys that are wondering, man, Dane, that doesn't look like that's going to be easy to do on a full weld car. Well, man, this is how I do it. Not saying it's right, not saying it's wrong. But spindles, inherently, I hear a lot of guys that want to move their ball joint forward with the intent to move the A-arm forward with the intent to move the kicker forward. That's a bad idea. When you move the top of your spindle forward, when you turn, the car goes up and down. Because what happens is if you pull this forward, now you're doing this. So every time this spindle goes towards the back, car goes down. Every time it goes to the front, car goes up. And your car does this all the time. It's really bad. It's really hard on stuff. The best way that I can found to do this is when you go to mount this, take you a plumb bob and plumb bob it straight down to the lower, put it where you want it, and make sure it's right in line with the lower, and then weld it on there. And it'll keep everything straight. It's pretty simple. Everybody's got a piece of string and a little weight they can put on there to line it all up. Because if you start messing with factory geometry and moving geometry forward, you're going to run into a lot of problems when you start moving spindles. Why do I know this? Because I've done it, and I've broke shit off many times because I thought, hey man, I walked by this guy's car, and man, he's badass, and I saw it looks like his ball joint and everything is moved forward. So I'm going to do that next time, and I'm going to get my kicker out there a little further, and my shit can be a little harder. And then come to find out, I blow the uppers apart because everything's leaned forward and you're putting way too much pressure on it. So yeah, I ran like this at Bash for Cash. I don't know if you're still allowed to run that style joint at Bash for Cash or not, but I ran it exactly like this. Just, build you a box, weld it on there. This is for these bigger ones, and then just overlay the A-arm on top of it. And then if you want to move the A-arm forward, move the A-arm forward. It doesn't matter. Because this is welded to the frame and this is all straight. So you can put the A-arm wherever you want. If you want to throw it 2 inches forward, throw 2 inches forward if it makes sense for your rules. Because sometimes you want to play that A-arm further forward, depending on how long your bumper bracket is, and sometimes you want to play it further backward, depending on how long your bumper bracket's allowed to be in relation to your A-arm. So it really just depends on the build. As I said, you know, these are all my opinions and my thoughts and stuff that I've done. I'm not trying to sell you guys on any of this, but that works. I know for a fact it works. There's a couple guys in this room that do it, so I know it works. But yeah, that's kind of how that I handle it and do that kind of stuff. Any questions on ball joints? Ball joints. Okay. Sweet. Oh, same with this. What I was talking about is like, so when you set your suspension on a standard spindle, everything is straight up and down. So if you look through the top hole of a spindle, you'll go through the bottom hole of the spindle. If you are messing with like Joker spindles, Joker used the spindle to fix all the ball joint geometry. So the spindle's all jacked up, but it puts all your ball joints in the center of the ball joint. Good idea. Ball joints rock back and forth, works fine. I ran them for a long time. But he uses the spindle to clean up the ball joint geometry. You can use fabrication to clean up the ball joint geometry and use a regular, spindle, because for those of you that just leave the ball joints where they go, whenever you drop your A-arm the whole way down, your ball joint is maxed out outward. It's touching this side. You can cut that, tip it up, do whatever you got to do, get that ball joint back in center so you have play both directions. That way if somebody catches your wheel, you're turning, and somebody catches your wheel here, it's trying to pull your ball joint off. It's got nowhere to go, so it's going to bend the ball joint. Big key for those of you that are newer to the game, most people know this stuff, but make sure you have something behind your spindle. So that way when your ball joint does bend, it runs into the frame. Unfortunately, if you start changing around a bunch of spindles, what you'll run into is, a Ford spindle isn't going to touch a Chevy frame when you run it the whole way down, so you have to put some sort of spacer or something in there. I'm going to tell you right now, I've put tons of spacers in there, and no inspector has ever made me cut out a spacer just to fill that gap to make sure when stuff starts moving, it hits. The most complicated one I was running a show where you had to run the aluminum cradle. You were allowed to weld. You were allowed to run a 1-inch shock, and most guys would just run the 1-inch shock. Well, I took the original piece and used that and made my own, let's call it a strut, but I just found that a 6-inch piece of pipe fits in between that gap perfectly, and then you just set that right against it. So if you're going to run, a 98 or an 09 and newer, that's one of the big problems. People rip the steering off them all the time, especially when you got to run aluminum steering. So I don't know if anybody makes anything like this. I just made this, but I know you can run it that way, and then everything bolts in up top, bolts in at the bottom, and then you actually have a spacer there that hits your spindle. I know that a lot of guys like to run Ford spindles on those. My opinion is Chevy. Why? Because this dimension on a Chevy is smaller. So what happens is the A-arms and everything come down further, and it actually pulls your wheels in. When you run a standard Ford, 70s Ford spindle here, everything actually stays out wider and ends up higher because of spindle height. Casey?
On the O3s, some of the cars that are here, if you look at them, in order to bring that ball joint closer into something to rest on, you'll notice that there's a certain A-arm that is being swapped out in our O3 spec class. We have it in a rule that you can run the OEM Ford A-arm for the O3 and up, which they made two for the Crown Vics. One's a cast style, solid, and the other one's a stamp style. But what really works good on them is a 99 Ford F-150. It's a shorter arm that brings it in.
Yeah. So, yeah. And there's lots of spindles out there, guys, that ran and played with or mounted about all of them. Jokers, CAs, HLKs, for somebody, myself, or whatever. Quickly on that, I don't know if it's a myth or not. If you don't know, you can attempt to weld to Chevy spindles. They're going to break apart. You put enough heat on forged Ford spindles and then you take the time to weld them and let them cool, it will totally hold up every time. You'll fix them from bending. A lot of them bend in the neck. If it's a set of rolls where, hey, maybe you can't afford to go buy the set of Joker spindles or whatever. Man, take you a Ford spindle, take it home. I'm sure you got a welder. Grind it up, put the torch to it, get it 400, 500, 600 degrees, weld to it, and let it sit. If you have the option, put it in a sand bath, let it cool even slower, and when you pull it out, it won't break. It won't. The forged spindles on Fords are weldable. Lots of people do it. I've seen them break, mostly because the mistake guys make is, man, I want to weld all these plates on there and then I dump a bucket of water on it. That instantly, makes that weld hard and it creates your heat affected zone for your weld, and it's just going to break on all your welds. So just let it cool. Let it take its time, let it cool. Don't get in a rush with it, and it'll hold up just fine. Chevys, on the other hand, they're way too brittle, they're way too cast. The material structure of them, they'll break apart every time I've ever tried to run them. A good way to know, because I don't know every spindle, good way to know is just, if you're not worried about running front brakes, just lock the spindle down in a vise, hit it really hard with a sledgehammer. If it breaks, you can't weld to it. If it bends, you can weld to it. It's an easy way to know. It just depends on how brittle the material is. So, yeah, really critical. Make sure you run some sort of upper ball joint support. Be it, this is like the worst scenario that I've ever had to try to make something work, was the set of rolls that we were running. This was the car that I was building. And I sat there for a couple days thinking, man, how am I going to support that thing? How am I going to make sure that when I get hit, it has something to run into? So figured I'd share that picture, give you food for thought on anything that you're building. Yeah, we talked about all that. We'll skip that. So lower control arms. There's a lot of lower control arms out there. This is mostly going to be a food for thought deal. So if you're building for stock rolls, certainly run the shock in the stock mount. Let everything travel. When you look at the relation of where the ball joint is to the shock, that gives you some flexibility on these, because for those of you that have ever ran these solid, they like to bend in here depending on, if you run your sway bar in here and have everything bolted down. Once you make the decision that you're going to weld the upper down, there is no set of rules I have ever seen anywhere that says you cannot relocate the shock. Okay, when you run solid suspension and you blow the top out of your ball joint, this had to bend, period. This had to bend in this area. It came up, blew the top out of the ball joint, that bent. It has to have. There's no other way it could have happened. So what you can do is you can take and don't mount the shock here, mount it way out there. That way it's supporting your lower up and down. And make sure that you support it both directions, because it's actually more important. You use your all-thread shock to pull everything together and set your ride height right. But it is more important to hold that down than it is to pull it up when you weld everything down. Because when you're out there bouncing, and if you don't have this held down with your shock, it's trying to push your upper out of the socket with all its might, as hard as it can. You need to use your shock to hold that down, period. And if the rules say you're only allowed to nut and bolt it, either weld it and hide it, or figure out a way to get the nut up inside the frame and make sure that's really tight and weld the nut up inside the frame. Because if you don't hold that down, you're putting all the pressure of all that suspension and everything that happens onto your upper. And that's why a lot of guys, when they run solid suspension cars, and you're out and you see them out there bouncing around, they blow the ball joints out of the top of the A-arm, is because they're not holding the lower down. Any food for thought there? It's my opinion. Obviously, you guys do what you want to do, but that's what I have to say about it. But yeah, if you've ever looked at any car that I've built in the last 5 years, I take the shock and move it from here, clear out as far as you can get it, because you use the shock to support the lower, and then your sway bar ties in there, and then you have a nice triangle where your shock comes down to your sway bar comes down to the frame comes across, all meets in the same spot, all supporting your ball joint. You could probably cut the A-arm off and it would just hang there, because it's all supported there. So, just food for thought. On sway bars, I'll give you my experience on the experiences on sway bars. 70s GMs, totally heatable, totally bendable. You can weld to them if you got to weld them to the frame. Fairly small diameter, they're fairly soft, they're going to bend. If you heat before you weld them, chances are they're not going to break. 98-02s, I've broken about 50 of them, either trying to put them on and they snap because you're putting them under so much pressure, or you're driving and this frame rail decides it's going to come up and this frame rail decides it's going to stay straight and it snaps it off. 09 and newer is the best sway bar that I have found that you can heat it, weld it, bend it. It's a large diameter and it's fairly flexible. I have never broken one. I've bent one in a banana, and you can do, if you've ever looked at one, they actually go like this. But this is it mounted on a 98-02 where I bent it to fit here, bent it to fit there, bent it to fit there, rolls down in, and then you bolt it solid just like anything else. Most places don't care if you swap sway bars. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of heat, a lot of bending, but my opinion is it's the best sway bar that is off a factory car that is both weldable, heatable, bendable, and is a large diameter. That's what I've found. I've broken lots and lots of 98-02 sway bars. Not saying they're not great, but they are brittle, and if you do bend them, they're going to break. The most overlooked component in steering system, in my opinion, is idler arms. How many people change the idler arm? Not a whole lot of people. A lot of guys run the factory idler arm that comes on the car, right? Unfortunately, your idler arm takes most of your abuse, especially if you run your tie rod angle at an angle at all. So if you run your tie rod arm at an angle at all, right here in this joint takes all the abuse. The best factory one that I've found is the 98-02. I put them on GMs, I put them on everything. They're like $100 from CarQuest or AutoZone. You get one that's loose, you go to a different one and tell them to warranty it. Dead serious. They'll give it to you every time. Till you come to the same one every week, right? But as long as you keep a receipt, I mean, that's what I do. I mean, especially if you're at a track, especially if you're a long way from home and you got one that's bent up, you can basically go to any AutoZone and they'll take it for warranty and you can slap it down there. Then you got stuff like this. This is the one I can find. I couldn't find pictures of the one that I made, but you can make, depending on rules and if you're allowed to swap steering suspensions, you can make an idler arm with brass bushings and other stuff to be able to take the abuse off the car. So what happens is with tie rod angles is when you run your tie rod angles lower, whenever you get hit and your other side's held, it's going to push everything up naturally, okay? That's going to put all the stress on the socket of the idler arm and the socket of the pitman arm. My opinion is 25 to 30 degrees is best because it's better to push it up and bend this. Anytime I've ever seen anybody run them straight, and I've seen a lot of guys do it, make custom steering, flip their tie rods to the top of the spindle, all kinds of stuff to avoid somebody going under them and breaking the spindles, you snap the pitman arm. Or you snap either the pitman arm off or you snap the bottom of the box off. Why? Because all your stress is on the pitman arm. As soon as you put everything flat, every time you take a hit, the only thing holding it is the bottom of the pitman arm. That's it. Because you're not bending this, you're not moving anything. And my opinion is at the end of the night, I'd rather have this piece bent every time than snap the bottom of the steering box off. And I've broken a lot of steering boxes when I started fooling with geometry of tie rods. And I found a sweet spot, and I've just kind of kept it there, and I've ran like that since. A lot of guys that go out and try to build all their own custom stuff, that they try to make it flat, and I guess my opinion is I would steer clear of that. This is a custom setup that's full built except for the idler arm, but basically, you know, brass bushing joint here, brass bushing joint on this end, machined out the pitman arm on that end, put a brass bushing inside of there, ran a bolt on both sides, run about a 20 to 30 degree tie rod angle that's through bolted through both sides, and then down here, it actually bolts to the bottom of the spindle. That setup worked for me for a long time until you go to certain shows and they all of a sudden decide you're not allowed to manipulate center links, but you can run hydro steering. Don't understand, but you know, that's how Derby works. That's the rules. So, you know, if you're allowed to change components, yeah, I've certainly done this. What I will tell you is everything you do here puts pressure on the box. So if you go buy 2-inch tie rods, because man, I don't want to bend tie rods, and I throw this giant tie rod end on it, and I slap everything on there, and I make that really hard, then I'm going to break the box or I'm going to bend the center link. If you're going to run a factory center link, you shouldn't be running any larger than a 1-inch diameter tie rod, because if you do, it's so hard, you're just going to break everything else. Like, stuff's got to bend and work. Derby cars need to be equal at whatever show you're going to run. If you put a 18-inch, you know, badass plate on the front of the car, and then for the next 5 inches there's nothing, and you got all your A-arm and stuff there, it's just going to bend there. Steering's no different. Everything just has to be equal. If you're going to soup up the tie rod, you need to soup up the center link. If you're going to soup up the center link, you got to soup up the bushings. If you're going to soup up the bushings, you need to have a good idler arm, and you need to make sure that you have the best box you can have. There's lots of guys out there that make boxes with custom box shafts that are made out of much stronger materials. If you didn't know that, now you do. It's not talked about a whole lot, but there's a few people that make them. You can buy them, and you know, you can buy aftermarket Saginaw boxes that have, you know, better shaft materials and stuff in them. But in the end, if you don't, it's just like anything else. If you're going to soup up one area, you have to do it all, or you're wasting your time and money. Because otherwise, it's just going to break in the next spot. That's about it, man. Other than that, I recommend going out and exploring other avenues. A lot of us get caught up in the demolition derby world. I see a lot of what guys do, and that's cool. But I spent a lot of my time looking at trophy truck steering, Baja steering, off-road steering. You can see, like, I know a lot of guys have ran and have seen like the hydro steer setup. But there's a lot of different stuff out there, and the way that people mount their suspension and how they do the bolting. Obviously, this is twice as strong as any standard ball joint because it's a double shear where your ball joint pin has to shear on both sides to bend it. Haven't got down to actually doing a fabricated piece like that for a derby car, but someday I'm sure that I will, and if somebody throws it out, it'll be what it is, but I want to try it. Why? Because that's what I like to do. My favorite part of building cars is doing different stuff every time and finding out what works and doesn't work. So, you know, look at other racing motorsports to find stuff, find parts, find ideas. And if you take anything away from this, it's whatever you do, do it equally from the car, front to back, steering, whatever it is. Make sure that you're hitting all the spots. And number two, look outside of demolition derby, because you're going to walk around here and everybody's going to want to sell you their latest, greatest ball joint. Everybody's going to want to sell you their latest, greatest spindle. And you're going to have what everybody else has. That's it. That's it. So if you want to do something a little different, it takes a little effort. But, you know, that's great because that's the sport of demolition derby, and that's what we get to do. So now if anybody has any questions, comments, concerns, by all means. Nothing. Nobody like, you're totally wrong. Like, I've done it that way for 50 years and it works. It's probably because you're a bad driver and don't get hitting the wheels like me. I suck and I get hitting the wheels all the time. Okay, well, if you got no questions, yeah, go ahead.
Just real quick, if you said like a stock build where you can only weld the uppers down or the lower to the frame, do you have a recommendation on which, you can only weld one set of, the uppers or.
Lower down every time. Because if you weld the
Lower
upper,
down.
if you weld the upper, well, let's back up. If you can do some shady stuff with the sway bar to hold it down, do that. But then weld the upper, but if you don't think you're gonna get away with that, weld the lower down. Use a shock or a bolt to hold the lower down, because if you weld the upper down, all your pressure is on that upper ball joint.
Yeah.
Every single
What
ounce.
I've done, going back to what you said earlier, is weld the lower down, but put it out close to the ball joint.
Yeah.
And then you can put it as a ball joint protector on the upper.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it's a great way to do
I
it.
still recommend, that's what.
Yeah. You can slide a piece of 2-inch way out here. If this was a car, you could 2x2 way out here, put it right behind it, load it all inside. Yeah, that's what I do. Case.
What's considered shady stuff?
Shady stuff is when it says in the rules you can't weld the sway bar and you weld it on anyway and put a rubber mount around it and bolt it on. We all do it. Don't pretend you don't.
Grease around it.
It's fine. Put some grease around it. If you ain't cheating at demolition derby today, or at least bending the rules in the gray areas, you're probably underbuilt. It's the truth. Everybody knows it. It's fine. As long as we're all open and honest about that, you know? I mean, I'm not gonna say that everybody out there blatantly plates frames, but you're gonna look at a set of rules, you're gonna use it to your total advantage, and then you're gonna see that, hey man, I got this frame covered except this one spot, and if I weld the sway bar on, I fix that spot, and it says don't weld the sway bar on. But if they catch me, worst case scenario, I can cut it off at the derby and bolt it on anyway. I'm gonna weld it on. Why wouldn't you? You can cut it apart when you get there. Like, seriously. Huh? Let's be forward. Like I said at the beginning of the talk, this is one derby guy talking to another. If you text me, call me, or ask me any questions over the internet, I will send you pictures. I will show you anything I have ever done, because I'm all about the progression of demolition derby. Period. Like, I blatantly showed you how I've welded stuff on frames that people probably wouldn't talk about, and moving stuff and doing things that not everybody thinks about. If you reach out to me and ask me, hey man, what do you think about this? And lots of people have. They send me a picture of, hey, this is what I got going on here, and say, what do you think I should do? I'm usually going to ask questions like, where are you building? What are you doing? What does this work? But I will, honest to God, tell you what I would do in the situation, because, you know, we're all here. Demolition derby is getting smaller and smaller. Everybody wants to win, obviously. Everybody wants to help it up. But one day you're going to be at that track, and you're going to need a part that you ain't got, period. And somebody else is going to have it. I don't care if you just beat the shit out of me in a demolition derby. I handed a guy the carburetor off my engine that I barely knew after he beat me because he needed a carburetor to run the feature. That's the right thing to do, period. So, that's it.
I've been around derbies 45 years, and that's stood true from
Right.
then to now.
Yeah.
It's always been that way.
Okay. Well, I'm done unless anybody else got anything else. Thanks for attending, appreciate it. Hopefully you learned something.